So, Grandstanding by Justin Tosh and Brandon Workman. I probably mispronounced those names. Anyway, this is a nonfiction book about, written by two moral philosophers about a recent trend that they've noticed in modern society that they have deemed grandstanding, which is one of those things that I think everyone's aware is a thing, but they never knew there was like an actual name for it. It's what you have probably heard called virtue signaling, but the authors make special note to say that that's that's a bad term for what is actually going on. The issue with grandstanding is that it's the abuse of moral talk. And the authors go on to talk about how it's incredibly necessary to have moral talk, but the increasing issue is that people use moral talk in an effort to communicate to the people around them that they are good people, not necessarily to have difficult moral discussions. In a word, grandstanding is the use of moral talk for personal promotion, is a bad thing that we should be against. The authors use multiple examples throughout their entire book, but it's not one of those books that go on to talk about how the evils of social justice warriors, or about how the alt-right are hypocrites or everything. They talk about this in a dispassionate way, I would say, that makes it clear that this is an issue for all political ideologies. Everyone does this kind of thing at time, where they are saying something without necessarily caring about what they say, but how it comes across. And it's worth noting that throughout this entire book, and I think it's worth noting, if the authors hadn't brought this up, I would have, that you don't have to necessarily be aware that you're doing this kind of thing. In a lot of ways, it's better if you're unaware that you're grandstanding, as it allows you to have a sense of plausible deniability to both yourself and other people. If you've ever read a book on sociobiology, you'll understand that a lot of the best strategies for human mating are really great if you're unaware that you're doing them. But also with that kind of unwitting grandstanding, there is a case of one doth protest too much, which is just a pretentious way of saying that the person is a hypocrite. And there does appear to be some evidence to back that kind of thing up, that the people who grandstand the most tend to be also those who are the most guilty of this kind of thing. It's a common complaint that the male feminist turns out to be a creep, right? Well, there appears to be some evidence to back that up. These people are morally denouncing others because they're afraid of their own failings. And that's not to say that if you care and you're a man, if you care about women's issues and you're a man, that you necessarily are this kind of person, or that somebody can't feel guilty about their actions and make sort of a redemption and kind of come to a kind of redemption, right? That's not really what that says. But it does say that a lot of the times these people do end up abusing that kind of moral talk to try and shore up their own reputation. Which also leads us to a false assumption of norms. I've brought up the term pluralistic ignorance in the past. Some people might not necessarily hold a position, but they think everyone else around them holds that position. So they verbalize that position. This is a false assumption of norms. We're holding up everyone else to norms that we don't necessarily believe in ourselves, because we want to communicate to those in our in-group that we are moral people worthy of being taken seriously. And because there's that kind of incentive to show to other people how moral of a person you are, there does tend to be a problem of trumping up moral concerns. And that is basically just when you interpret something in such a way that, you could say I'm apologizing for European colonialism by saying, a lot of natives were in fact cannibals, right? Or I could be saying that a lot of natives were in fact cannibals and that the genocide of the Native Americans was wrong, regardless of if it happened to good or bad people. Now, that could be a kind of grandstanding, you know? I think that this is wrong regardless of what the other people do. That does, you know, that could be my attempt to communicate to you that I'm a moral person despite holding beliefs that you might find icky. But it could also just be my genuine opinion on things, which is why you should probably not, which is why the authors in this book point out that you probably should not point to people and accuse them of grandstanding. The best thing you can do for this kind of thing is to frankly ignore it. If you see somebody grandstanding, don't talk about it. If they said something factually inaccurate, I would say correct them on that, and they might morally denounce you in return, in which case you can be pretty sure that they're going to be you can be pretty sure they're grandstanding, but don't react to that kind of thing. And one final note that the authors make is that is bringing up the better than average effect. That's just how people tend to see themselves as a little bit better than average at every facet in their life. That includes their moral intuition. Meaning in this effect, most people assume that they're more moral than the average person, when in all honesty, most of us are no better than average when it comes to morality. The common example I give is most people, if they were born into a slave-holding family, would probably have owned slaves, but there's a tendency for a lot of people to denounce those that actually did, like a bunch of protesters tore down a Ulysses S. Grant statue, because assuming that they would have been any better than these people. It's worth noting that Ulysses S. Grant, whereas he did own a slave at one point in his life, did set the guy free, and went on to smash the Confederacy and end slavery forever. So it's not even a case of, for the time, this was average. It's if you had been born in that time, you wouldn't have done any better. You would have probably been worse. So yeah, basically I think this is a pretty important book that you probably should read if you get a chance. If you like nonfiction, I would say it pairs pretty well with Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, which talks a lot about why people believe things or say that they believe things, stressing that whereas moral talk is important and we do need to have difficult conversations, most of the time people are not having those difficult conversations. They're, grandstanding.
It's time someone had the courage to stand up and say, I'm against those things that everybody hates.